On the morning of February 13th, 2003, businessman Anil Chohan walked out of his office believing he was about to complete the biggest business deal of his life. He told his staff he was heading to a meeting near Stonehenge with investors interested in buying his successful freight company. If everything went according to plan, he and his wife Nancy could finally begin the life they had been dreaming about for years. No one at the office imagined it would be the last time they would ever see him alive. Within days, Anil, his wife Nancy, their 2 young sons, and Nancy's mother would all vanish without a trace. There would be no goodbye, no phone calls, and no explanation. Their home would remain exactly as they had left it, as if an ordinary family had simply disappeared in the middle of everyday life. At first, police believed they had chosen to leave the country voluntarily, but the truth was far darker. Behind the disappearance was an elaborate criminal plot driven by greed, deception, and an obsession with wealth. It was a plan so carefully executed that investigators initially struggled to believe such a crime had even taken place. This is the story of how one ruthless criminal tried to erase an entire family and nearly succeeded. By 2003, Anil Chohan had built a respected business in the freight industry. Operating from Heathrow Airport, his company, Ciba Freight, specialized in importing and transporting produce from overseas. The business was profitable, well-established, and employed a loyal workforce that respected Anil not only as their employer, but as a genuinely decent man. Employees remembered him as relaxed and approachable. During busy periods, he worked alongside everyone else, ordering pizzas for the staff and creating an atmosphere that felt more like family than business. But success also made him vulnerable. The freight industry offered opportunities that attracted more than legitimate entrepreneurs. Criminal organizations had long used import businesses to move illegal drugs through ports and airports while hiding behind seemingly respectable companies. Early in 2003, a man named Kenneth Regan appeared looking for work. Recently released from prison, Regan claimed he wanted a fresh start. He presented himself as someone determined to rebuild his life after serving time. Anil understood what prison could do to a person. Years earlier, he himself had served a sentence for tax-related offenses and believed people deserved another chance. Rather than judging Regan by his criminal record, he hired him as a driver. To the staff, Regan appeared hardworking and dependable. Few realized they were welcoming an experienced career criminal into the company. Before his imprisonment, Kenneth Regan had operated at the highest levels of organized drug trafficking. Using freight businesses around Heathrow as cover, he had helped smuggle large quantities of narcotics into Britain, earning enormous sums of money and the nickname Captain Cash. Support us grow our channel by clicking the subscribe button. Friends remembered him constantly carrying large amounts of cash, expensive watches, and designer clothing. He enjoyed projecting the image of a wealthy businessman, although much of his fortune had come from criminal activity. His success eventually came crashing down. In 1998, authorities arrested Regan after discovering approximately 25 kilograms of heroin in his possession. Facing the possibility of spending nearly 2 decades behind bars, he chose to cooperate with investigators. His testimony helped convict numerous criminals, significantly reducing his own sentence. But cooperation came at a price. When he left prison 4 years later, his criminal associates considered him a traitor. His assets had been confiscated, his money was gone, and he had been forced to move back into his father's modest home. For a man accustomed to luxury, the fall was devastating. Regan wasn't interested in rebuilding an honest life. He wanted his old lifestyle back, and he believed Anil Chohan's company could provide the perfect opportunity. Unlike starting from nothing, taking over an established freight company would instantly give him access to warehouses, transportation networks, and international shipping routes. Exactly the infrastructure needed to resume large-scale drug importation. The only obstacle was the company's owner. Instead of stealing the business through fraud alone, Regan devised a plan that would permanently remove Anil from the picture. He approached Anil with what sounded like an extraordinary opportunity. Regan claimed he knew wealthy investors eager to purchase Ciba Freight for £3 million. It was an astonishing offer. Nancy had often spoken about returning to India with their children. She missed home, believed the children would receive an excellent education there, and hoped the family could eventually retire. Selling the company would make that dream possible. As Anil considered the proposal, Regan quietly prepared the next stage of his plan. At the same time, another person unknowingly became part of his scheme. Belinda Bruin, a well-known socialite and celebrity agent, had first encountered Regan years earlier. She found him charming in a rough, unpolished way, but never considered him anything more than an acquaintance. Regan, however, became obsessed. He repeatedly telephoned and emailed her, claiming he had developed overwhelming feelings despite barely knowing her. The attention became increasingly unsettling. Eventually, she discovered he had been telling other people they were in a relationship, even though no such relationship existed. Shortly afterward, Regan was imprisoned, and the unwanted contact stopped. For 4 years, Belinda heard nothing. Then, after Regan's release, he contacted her again. This time he presented himself as a businessman with an exciting opportunity. Belinda's circumstances had changed dramatically. She had moved to rural Devon, was dealing with financial pressures, and needed a reliable source of income. Regan claimed he was in the process of acquiring a freight company and needed someone to manage it. Despite Belinda having no experience in the freight industry, he offered her an extraordinarily generous salary for working only 2 days a week. The offer seemed unusual, but difficult to refuse. Belinda agreed. She had no idea she was stepping into the middle of one of Britain's most disturbing murder investigations. As spring turned into April, investigators had been searching for the Chohan family for more than 2 months. Despite countless interviews, forensic examinations, and telephone analysis, they still had no bodies and no murder scene. Then an unexpected discovery transformed the investigation. One calm evening, 2 friends set out in canoes off the Dorset coast, hoping for a peaceful trip on the water. The sea was unusually still. With good weather and excellent visibility, they decided to paddle farther from shore than they normally would. As they moved across the water, one of the canoeists noticed what appeared to be several objects floating in the distance. At first, neither man paid much attention. Drifting debris was not uncommon. But as they drew closer, it became clear that this was something entirely different. One of the objects was a human body. It floated face down, partially submerged, swollen after spending days in the sea. Realizing the seriousness of what they had found, one of the men immediately paddled back toward shore to call emergency services while the other remained beside the body. For nearly 3 hours, he stayed there alone in the gathering darkness, unwilling to leave it unattended. Long after that evening ended, he would remember the haunting image of the body drifting silently on the water. The victim was transported to a mortuary for identification. Several agonizing days later, detectives confirmed what they had feared. The body belonged to Anil Chohan. For the first time since the family vanished, investigators knew with certainty they were dealing with murder. The post-mortem examination painted a disturbing picture. Anil had suffered a powerful blow to the back of his head. Packing tape had been tightly wrapped around his mouth. Pathologists concluded that blunt force trauma followed by suffocation was the most likely cause of death. The official missing person inquiry instantly became one of Britain's highest priority murder investigations. At the same time Anil's body was being examined, forensic teams were still processing evidence recovered from Belinda Bruin's field. The significance of those findings now became much clearer. Human hairs recovered from the excavation were identified as Anil's. Burned clothing fragments and jewelry showed that the trench had almost certainly been used as a temporary burial site. Investigators now believe they understood part of the killer's plan. After Anil was murdered, his body had been transported to Devon and buried inside the freshly dug trench. Later, the grave had been reopened. The body had been removed, loaded onto a boat, taken offshore, and dumped into the sea in an attempt to destroy evidence forever. The discovery devastated everyone who had known him. Employees at Ciba Freight had continued hoping that one day their former boss would simply return. Now those hopes were gone. But an even more troubling question remained unanswered. Where were Nancy, her mother, and the 2 young boys? The evidence from the excavation suggested that the grave had originally contained more than one body. Investigators recovered jewelry believed to belong to Nancy. They also found small metal fasteners identical to those commonly used on baby clothing. The trench itself had been far larger than necessary for a single victim. Everything pointed toward the horrifying possibility that the entire family had been buried there before being moved elsewhere. Detectives now believed Kenneth Regan had not murdered one person. He had almost certainly murdered 5. The investigation expanded dramatically. Resources poured into the case. Search teams revisited every location connected to Regan, William Hornsey, and Peter Reese. Every movement made by the suspects was re-examined. But by the time police focused their attention on them, Regan and Hornsey had already disappeared. Both men had fled Britain. Only Peter Reese remained somewhere in the country. Meanwhile, Belinda Bruin struggled to process what investigators had uncovered on her property. The realization that her peaceful field had become part of a murder investigation was almost impossible to accept. She tried to keep herself occupied, hoping routine would distract her from the nightmare unfolding around her. One afternoon, she loaded a horse blanket into her car and drove along the narrow lane leading away from the farm. Then she froze. Coming toward her was a familiar vehicle. Inside sat Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey. Belinda couldn't believe they had returned. Regan lowered his window and calmly told her they needed to talk. Hornsey suggested they all drive somewhere for coffee. Every instinct told her not to get into that car. Thinking quickly, she invented an excuse. Holding up the horse blanket, she claimed she needed to return it to a nearby cottage and promised she would come back in just a few minutes. The men accepted the explanation. Instead of returning, Belinda drove around the corner and immediately telephoned Detective Chief Inspector Rowell. When he heard who she had encountered, his response was immediate. Whatever happened, she was not to meet them. Officers were dispatched to the area as quickly as possible. But by the time police arrived, Regan and Hornsey had vanished once again. Their disappearance only deepened investigators' suspicions. It was becoming increasingly obvious that both men knew the investigation was closing in around them. As police intensified the search, another unexpected development emerged. Peter Reese, now separated from his accomplices, was living quietly in a boarding house. Away from Regan's influence, the pressure appeared to be taking its toll. He began speaking to another resident, a woman named Wendy Powles. At first, she assumed he was simply making conversation. Then he started saying things that no ordinary person would ever say. He admitted he had been involved in the disappearance of an Asian family. He insisted he hadn't personally killed anyone, but acknowledged police could place him where the bodies had been buried. As he continued talking, his story became even more disturbing. He described Kenneth Regan as dangerous and completely out of control. Then he made a statement Wendy would never forget. According to Reese, Regan had murdered everyone, including the 2 children. When he was horrified, she realized she had just heard what amounted to a confession connected to one of the country's biggest murder investigations. Without hesitation, she contacted police. Within days, officers arrested Peter Reese at a nearby pub. Although he had spoken freely to Wendy, Reese refused to cooperate once he was in custody. He answered no questions. He revealed nothing about the missing family members. The silence continued. Then, only weeks later, investigators received another grim call from the South Coast. A fisherman had discovered yet another body floating in the water. This time, it was Nancy Chohan. The recovery of Nancy Chohan's body confirmed investigators' worst fears. This was no longer a case involving a single victim. Someone had deliberately wiped out an entire family. For Nancy's brother, Onkar Varma, the confirmation was devastating. Despite everything investigators had uncovered, a small part of him had continued hoping his sister would somehow be found alive. Instead, he was asked to identify her remains. The experience would stay with him forever. He later said that, to him, she wasn't simply another victim in a murder case. She was still his little sister. Standing in the mortuary, he said goodbye knowing there was nothing more he could have done to save her. While police continued searching for the remaining victims, the hunt for Kenneth Regan spread beyond Britain's borders. Regan had disappeared shortly after detectives uncovered the burial site in Devon. William Hornsey had vanished as well. Their flight only reinforced investigators' belief that both men knew exactly what had happened to the Chohan family. International inquiries eventually led police to Belgium. After nearly 2 months on the run, Kenneth Regan was located and arrested. His capture marked a major breakthrough. Several weeks later, William Hornsey also surrendered to authorities. Now, all three principal suspects, Regan, Hornsey, and Peter Reese, were finally in custody. But investigators still faced an enormous challenge. None of the suspects would answer questions. No one admitted involvement. No one explained what had happened to Nancy, her mother, or the two young boys. Without confessions or eyewitnesses, prosecutors needed overwhelming physical evidence to prove the case. The investigation became one of the largest and most complex murder inquiries Britain had ever seen. Detectives painstakingly reconstructed every movement made by the suspects during the days surrounding the disappearances. Telephone records became one of their most powerful tools. By analyzing thousands of mobile phone connections, investigators built an almost minute-by-minute timeline. The data revealed that after Anil met Regan near Stonehenge, his phone traveled alongside the phones belonging to Regan, William Hornsey, and Peter Reese. Together, they moved toward Salisbury. More specifically, they arrived at Regan's home on Forge Close in Wilton. The phone records showed something investigators found particularly significant. Throughout the critical period following Anil's disappearance, at least one suspect's phone remained near the property almost continuously. Detectives believed this indicated that Anil was being held there against his will. If true, it explained how Regan had managed to obtain documents apparently signed by Anil after he was supposed to have voluntarily sold his company. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of William Hornsey's own family members approached police, carrying several items that would prove invaluable. Among them was a Lexmark color printer. There was also a gray suitcase containing numerous sheets of paper bearing Anil Chohan's genuine signature. Some were completely blank except for the signature itself. Investigators immediately understood their significance. Police believed Anil had been forced to sign blank pages while being held captive. Those signatures could later be used to create convincing forged documents supporting the false story that he had willingly sold his business and left the country. Suddenly, the paperwork shown to Ciba Freight employees after Anil's disappearance made perfect sense. It hadn't been signed during a legitimate business transaction. It had almost certainly been created under duress. According to prosecutors, Regan's plan required complete control over Anil's company. But once Anil disappeared, Nancy would inevitably begin asking questions. She knew her husband. She would never believe he had abandoned his family without warning. Investigators concluded that, after deciding to eliminate Anil, Regan believed there was only one way to ensure the deception survived. The rest of the family had to disappear too. Exactly where they were killed remained uncertain. Telephone evidence showed Regan and Hornsey traveling to the Chohan family home in Hounslow, while Peter Reese stayed behind in Salisbury. Detectives believe those movements coincided with the disappearance of Nancy, her mother, and the two children. Although they could never establish every detail beyond doubt, prosecutors argued that greed, not anger, revenge, or desperation, had driven every decision Regan made. To him, the murders were simply obstacles removed in pursuit of money. Investigators also returned repeatedly to Regan's bungalow. If Anil had been held there, surely some trace of violence remained. Yet forensic examinations initially produced surprisingly little evidence. Rooms had recently been redecorated. Carpets had been removed. Furniture had disappeared. Fresh replacements had already been installed. To detectives, the renovations looked less like home improvements and more like a deliberate effort to erase a crime scene. Still, suspicion alone would never secure convictions. They needed something far more powerful. Something that could place Anil inside Regan's home during the period he was being held captive. Ironically, that evidence had been sitting in police storage for months without anyone realizing its importance. Sometimes, the smallest overlooked detail becomes the key to solving an entire case. In this investigation, that detail was hiding inside an ordinary sock. By the time the case reached court, investigators had assembled one of the most detailed murder cases in British criminal history. The trial began at the Old Bailey in April 2005 and would stretch over the next 9 months. It became the longest criminal trial ever heard at the historic court. Thousands of exhibits were presented before the jury. Financial records, telephone data, vehicle movements, forensic reports, witness testimony. Every piece of evidence helped reconstruct a crime that had been designed to leave almost nothing behind. Although investigators had built a compelling case, one question still lingered. Could they prove beyond reasonable doubt that Anil Chohan had been held captive inside Kenneth Regan's bungalow? The answer came from an item that had almost been forgotten. After Anil's body was recovered from the sea, his clothing had been removed and cataloged for forensic examination. Most garments were sent immediately to scientists. His socks, however, attracted little attention. There was rarely much evidential value in them. Months later, as part of a routine review, investigators decided to send the remaining clothing for examination anyway. When forensic scientists carefully unfolded one of the socks, they made an astonishing discovery. Hidden deep inside was a tiny piece of folded paper. The document had survived weeks in seawater because it had been folded so tightly and protected by the fabric. Scientists slowly opened the fragile paper. It wasn't random. It was a letter addressed to Kenneth Regan. Even more importantly, it was addressed to his home at 3 Forge Close, Wilton. The date on the letter was February 12, 2003, exactly when investigators believed Anil was being held prisoner inside that house. For detectives, the discovery was extraordinary. They believed Anil had secretly hidden the document inside his sock while being held captive. He knew he might never escape. If his body was eventually found, perhaps someone would discover what he had concealed. It was a desperate attempt to identify the place where he was imprisoned. Even in the final hours of his life, Anil had managed to leave investigators a message. It was, in effect, evidence from beyond the grave. The letter placed him inside Kenneth Regan's home at the very time prosecutors said he had been held against his will. Combined with the telephone evidence, forged documents, excavation findings, and witness testimony, it became one of the strongest pieces of evidence presented to the jury. Prosecutors argued that Kenneth Regan had orchestrated every stage of the conspiracy. First, he earned Anil's trust. Then he lured him to what appeared to be a legitimate business meeting. After taking control of him, he forced Anil to sign documents that would later make the sale of Ciba freight appear genuine. Once those signatures had been obtained, prosecutors said there was no reason to keep him alive. The rest of the family, they argued, became victims simply because they knew too much. Nancy would have questioned her husband's disappearance. Her mother was living with them. The two young boys were innocent witnesses whose lives were stolen before they had truly begun. Everything, prosecutors maintained, was done for one reason: greed. Regan wanted Anil's business. He wanted its warehouses, its reputation, its shipping network, and ultimately, he wanted to use it as a platform to rebuild the criminal empire he had lost after his imprisonment. The defense challenged much of the prosecution's interpretation. But as weeks turned into months, the weight of evidence continued to grow. Telephone records linked the suspects together. Forensic evidence connected Anil to the burial site. Witnesses described Regan's suspicious behavior before and after the disappearances. Belinda Bruin explained how she had unknowingly become part of the deception. Wendy Powles recounted Peter Reese's disturbing confession. And finally, the letter hidden inside Anil's sock tied everything back to Regan's home. After hearing 9 months of evidence, the jury retired to consider its verdict. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. Kenneth Regan was found guilty of murdering all 5 members of the Chohan family. William Hornsey was also convicted of the 5 murders. Peter Reese was convicted for his role in the murder of Anil Chohan. The sentences reflected the scale of the crimes. Regan and Hornsey each received 5 consecutive life sentences, ensuring they would never be released. Reese was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for his involvement in the conspiracy. Although justice had finally been delivered, the investigation was not entirely over. Searches continued for the remaining victims. Eventually, the remains of Nancy's mother, Chiranjit Kaur, were recovered off the coast of the Isle of Wight. But despite extensive searches, the bodies of 18-month-old Devinder and 8-week-old Ravinder were never found. Their disappearance remains one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case. For Detective Andy Rowell and the officers who worked on the investigation, The murders stood apart from almost every other case they had encountered. Police often find explanations rooted in rage, mental illness, or moments of uncontrollable violence. This case was different. It was calculated. Every decision appeared planned. Every victim represented another obstacle standing between Kenneth Regan and the fortune he believed he deserved. For Onkar Varma, however, the case was never about legal arguments or courtroom verdicts. It was about family. While searching through his sister's belongings after the investigation, he discovered a home video recorded just 2 days before everyone disappeared. The footage showed an ordinary family enjoying ordinary moments. Nancy smiled at the camera. Anil laughed with his children. Their eldest son proudly took his first steps while relatives celebrated around him. His mother smiled as she watched her grandchildren play. The recording captured happiness frozen in time. It became the final memory Onkar would ever have of them together. He has often said that when he watches the video, he doesn't immediately think about the murders. Instead, he remembers the life his sister had built. A loving husband, 2 beautiful children, a close family looking forward to the future. Those moments remind him of who they were before greed and cruelty brought everything to an end. More than 2 decades later, the Chohan family murder case remains one of Britain's most shocking criminal investigations. It exposed how a carefully planned deception nearly convinced everyone that an entire family had simply chosen to disappear. Had Anil Chohan not hidden that single folded letter inside his sock? Had Belinda Bruin not spoken honestly about the mysterious trench? Had ordinary members of the public not come forward when something felt wrong? The truth may never have been uncovered. Instead, through painstaking detective work and a series of remarkable discoveries, investigators exposed one of the most ruthless murder conspiracies in modern British history. It was a crime driven not by passion or revenge, but by a man's willingness to destroy an entire family in pursuit of wealth. If you enjoy our true crime documentaries, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.